Okay, let's talk about sadness. Now, all the emotions are important, and if you've watched any of the other videos, you'll know that I communicate that pretty passionately. This one, however, I think is of critical importance these days because, as I see it from my own viewpoint, society is losing its ability to tolerate distress, particularly from the younger generations. Now, I'm not going to get into the reasons why. I'm only going to deal with what I see. So the effect of whatever's bringing us to this point is that we don't know how to tolerate sadness. Well, what is sadness? Sadness's purpose is to tell us that our expectations simply were not met. Okay, that's it. Goodbye. No, I'm just kidding. So if we think about this, we all have expectations. Some of them we're aware of, some of them we're not. And I'll highlight a few examples here. So if I'm teaching this to a group, usually I just pick on somebody in the group and I say, all right, so-and-so in the front row, what's your name? And they say, hi, my name's Dave or whatever. And I say, all right, so if Dave and I get up and walk out of here, Dave doesn't know that he has an expectation not to get his shoes stepped on when we leave the room. But if I walk a little too close, I'm not paying attention, I step on his shoe, I give him a flat tire, what ends up happening there is I've created sadness in Dave, meaning I should feel some shame. Now I'm going to talk about the shame and guilt in another video, but what is important is that Dave's expectation not to have his shoe stepped on was not anywhere near his awareness until it happened, until he didn't get it met. So he's going to be like, hey man, I failed to meet his expectation. That was an unconscious expectation. Well, let's talk about a conscious expectation. I have an expectation if I walk into a Burger King, for example, that I'm going to get a Whopper and a Dr. Pepper, and I give my order and they say, great, we're going to prepare that. Here's your cup. All right, go ahead and go get it. I walk over to the soda clicker stand, and if you watch the excitement interest video, you know how much I love those. And I walk up and I put my cup under the little clicker lever to get my Dr. Pepper, and soda water comes out. That's disappointment. That's on the low end of the continuum of this sadness spectrum. So we got a little bit of sadness called disappointment, all the way up to very large sadness that we might call anguish, right? Or despair. It's important to note because they're the same emotion, and we all know this because what I mentioned in other videos is that we all have the same 10 emotions, which means we can communicate very well with each other if we speak to those emotions. So if I say, well, that's disappointing, or some other synonym or proxy for sadness, people go, yeah, that is disappointing, right? Now we've validated them. But if I miss, right, and if I guess wrong, chances are pretty good somebody will correct me. But if I say, oh man, that's messed up. Well, messed up is not a feeling. That's it's not really validating. It misses the mark. I might be like, yeah, it is messed up, I guess, but I don't know why it's messed up. Maybe it was an accident. So is it really messed up? No, that's a judgment. That's an idea. It's a belief. What is accurate is it's sad. It's sad. I didn't get my Dr. Pepper. Okay. More drawing. This is a wave, right? And there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to all emotional experiences, including this one. Right here in the middle is where I lose control. And if I'm good and I've practiced at this, I will be able to go, oh, no Dr. Pepper. I go down the wave, just a few seconds, right? Remember, it's about 3 to 9 seconds is all that lasts in the brain. Now I'm back into cognition. I can go, Coke's a good choice. I don't have to start dropping F-bombs on the manager for not having my Dr. Pepper. I don't have to start cursing the distributor for not bringing it. I don't have to, go slip into something that covers over my disappointment simply because I can't tolerate it. Now, why would I not be able to tolerate my disappointment? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Here's what I see happening in our society these days. Instead of teaching children, and we adults are guilty of this too, to tolerate that emotional wave by riding through it and letting them be in distress, we're bailing them out. Now, this has been going on for years too. This isn't something new that just occurred in the last, since the advent of social media or whatever. But boys in particular, males, have been told they're not allowed to be sad. They're not allowed to be scared. They're not allowed to be embarrassed. They're not allowed sometimes even to feel happiness. And so what we end up doing is they start to feel the sadness, and then we go, knock it off, and we bail them out of it. That's problematic. And here's why. If I don't train my brain that this little level is tolerable, I'm not going to get to the bigger levels. Life gets bigger as it goes on. And I've talked about this in the other videos. But if I've trained my brain to bail out, I've self-invalidated or somebody else has done it for me, what ends up happening is when I confront real disappointment, like the inability to get a job, or maybe I get fired from a job, that certainly doesn't meet expectations, right? If we expect to work at some place for longer than we do and they can us, especially if they don't tell us, or maybe somebody breaks up with us, you know, our romantic partner dumps us and they don't tell us why, they just quit returning the phone calls. We're left not knowing how to deal with that great sadness because we didn't practice tolerating the lower sadness. The cool thing about emotional functioning is that once you've gone through an emotional experience, your body knows what that is. So the next time it happens, it may go, oh, this is bigger than I am used to, but I can deal with it. And so we allow ourselves to push through. Now I'm going to erase my sad face here because it's just sad. But I'm going to draw something for you. So remember these waves, right? So there's a little low wave that we might experience when we're 2, 3 years old, when we don't get what we want. Our parents are trying to redirect our behavior. If the parents allow us to push through that distress, then our brains learn that we can get through it and we'll be okay. So the next time the parents tell us to do something, or somebody throws sand in our face on the playground, or we don't get the grade we wanted on the test, or the girl we're crushing on chooses somebody else, or we get dumped, we don't get into the college we want, our dog dies, grandma dies, whatever. Our brains know that we can get through it. It's the same emotional experience. It's just a little bigger, right? But if we don't practice down here, there's no way we're going to get up here. And then we end up actively denying emotional experiences through life. And we end up becoming very flat-faced, and we don't know how to communicate very well because we won't let ourselves get to this point where we lose control right at the top of the curve. So developmentally, it's important to go through these things in order. So what happens when somebody goes through something that's this level, say it's a really gruesome car accident where somebody really gets hurt or somebody dies, God forbid, but they experience it at age 7. That's called trauma. Now, I know there's a lot of different definitions and interpretations of trauma. This one works for me, and it works for the people I teach, and it works for my patients. So I'm just going to stick with this for now. So through an emotional functioning lens, if you get exposed to something that outstrips your developmental stage, you get trauma. Do that often enough, and you get chronic trauma, and there's a whole bevy of problems that come along with that, and I'm not going to get into in this video. But what is important to know is that we have to push through no matter what, because then it teaches us that it's tolerable. Otherwise, if we keep avoiding, we keep bailing out, and spoiling does this too. So if my kid's crying, and I just like throw candy at him and distract him and say, here, turn on the TV. I've bailed him out of it, and I've given something to him that he didn't ask for, but is a reward. So there's a behavioral consequence there too that I want to avoid if I want to teach my kids how to tolerate emotion. Okay, so if this happens to somebody, we have to validate it. We have to be like, yeah, that's so disappointing. That's so sad. I can't believe X happened to you. Okay, here's what happens when we involuntarily teach our kids, or train them, if you will, to avoid emotion. They end up becoming flat-faced. Nobody knows what they're feeling, right? All emotion ends up looking bottomless, so they just don't go there. It creates an intimacy problem in their relationships later on in life where they can't open up, they can't be vulnerable, and vulnerability is a big deal because vulnerability is what connects us to other human beings. The problem with vulnerability is it invites risk. Risk of what? Pain. We could get let down by people. Well, why go there? And oh, by the way, if sadness is one of those emotions I'm not good at tolerating, I'm not really interested in inviting it in the first place. So we want to make sure that we're validating. Purposely, we train adults to go through emotions very quickly. So let's take fear, for example. There's another fear video out there where I didn't talk about this, but I'm in the waves right now, right? So if trauma can happen when it outstrips your developmental stage, how do we get people like emergency room doctors to override their disgust response, and police not to freak out when they show up at at an active shooter, or firefighters when they show up to a burning building? How do we get them to not give in to that fear or that disgust or that sadness, scene of an automobile accident, for example? We train them. We purposely expose them to things that go above and beyond the normal course, and I'll just keep drawing up here, but I'm not going to draw on my own wall, the normal course of life events, so that they're specially trained. We go through it too. We go through role plays, and we go through case analyses and all sorts of stuff in the mental health profession, so that we ourselves don't get shocked out of our skins when somebody lays on a tale of tragedy and trauma with us in our offices. Okay? But when 9/11 happened and the terrorists flew the planes into the building, no amount of training could have prepared us for that. And I'm reaching way off the screen up here that you can't see. That was a level of emotional experience no one could have anticipated and no one was mentally prepared for. That was traumatizing. And it didn't just traumatize the people on the ground. And something we found out through our research was that our profession, really up until that point, had never really given the idea to vicarious trauma. We'd always believed that trauma had to happen directly to the individual or to somebody who observed the individual. Now, unfortunately, we still have some of this language in our book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is called the DSM, and it's now in its 5th iteration, DSM-5. You may have heard of that. That tells us how to diagnose things. And it still says, person directly experienced or witnessed, right? Now, they do now have a section in the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnostic category that says, or if you've experienced repeated exposure to violent, disturbing, blah, 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 in the line of your work. And what they don't say is that you can experience trauma outside of work. I don't know why they do this. It drives me bonkers. But nonetheless, that's our diagnostic criteria right now. We know through lots and lots of anecdotal research in the office that children exposed to violent imagery and sad imagery and disgusting imagery on the internet creates trauma because it outstrips their developmental stage by exposing them to something up here. Pornography does this too, by the way. Sexual exposure outstrips the developmental stage, and what it ends up doing is blunting your ability to go down the other side of the curve. We're emotionally invalidating our children by inadvertently exposing them over and over and over and over to repeated imagery. The same thing happened across the country when we watched the buildings collapsing and the planes flying into them over and over and over and over again. We all got traumatized. And I'll tell you, maybe not all, that's extreme, but I'll tell you, many of us did. And my personal experience was, it happened on a Tuesday. Friday, I was walking down to a candlelight vigil in downtown Reno, and I was looking at the casinos, just scanning rooftops, wondering if planes were going to fly into our casinos. That was an absurd thought. It made no sense, and here's why. The planes were grounded at that time. There were no flights in the entire United States. But yet I was still anticipating it. I had nightmares. I had flashbacks. I imagined it was happening to me. I didn't sleep well. I was sick to my stomach. All of the symptoms that meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. I wasn't in New York or Washington, D.C. or Pennsylvania, but I had it. So now think about the repeated imagery that you or your children are experiencing that outstrips their developmental stage. This is a problem. So I'm talking about trauma in the sadness category because one of the expectations that we have is that children's innocence will more or less be preserved until they're adults, and they should go through these processes at a natural, normal speed. And when that doesn't happen, we're surprised by it, and then we're disappointed. We're pulling our hair like, why? I don't understand why Johnny's disconnected from school and he's having nightmares. Like nothing happened to him. It's like, yeah, he's been online. That's the problem. And that's disappointing and it's distressing. So let's get back to the distress tolerance for a second though, and talk about how when we're dealing with sadness as an emotion, what we want to do is we want to validate, but then we also want to understand our own process. So something I see that happens all the time in group settings is we'll be doing a group processing experience and somebody has a tearful emotional response, and almost invariably the person next to them wants to lay a hand on their thigh and you're like, there, it's going to be okay. Or somebody else jumps right to cognitive and they go to problem solving, like, did you hire an attorney? Like, did you get a protection order? They're not willing to sit with the person in their distress, not because they necessarily want that person out of distress, but because they themselves can't tolerate it. Where does that come from? Inability to tolerate the wave. They haven't practiced it enough in themselves, therefore they can't stand watching somebody else do it. So my job as a clinician then is to say, whoa, let's let this give a little space, and then check in on the people who wanted to jump in and bail out the person who was being sad. You're like, hey, what was going on for you right there? It's really tough to watch that, wasn't it? Yeah, it was. Oh, I wonder what went on in your life that's inappropriate or it's intolerable. And that's real good processing. It also creates validation. So if we go back to yield theory and Christian Conti's work, the 3 steps for really communicating well: listen, then validate, drain the limbic system, then explore options. If you just jump right to explore options, you're not going to be heard. There's a lot more to say about this emotion. I want to try to keep these videos short though. I hope this was instructive. If you have feedback or you just want to throw rotten eggs at me because you think that what I said is hogwash, that's fine too. Please don't actually throw rotten eggs at me. I would find that disgusting. And you can learn more about disgust in a different video. But info@zephyrwellness.org is where you can reach us, or put something in the comments section. We monitor that fairly regularly, and I'd love to hear back from you. So I understand this is touchy. I understand that it can drive people to some introspection. That's good. That's a good thing. I say it all the time that this information doesn't do any good locked up in my head. I want to get it out and share it with people. Emotional instruction is not part of most people's curricula. So the more we can learn here, the better off I think we'll all be in society. On behalf of the Zephyr Wellness family, I thank you for watching. Please share around. And as always, I wish you great mental wellness.